I'm Mike Orlock. I'm here in Sturgeon Bay. I moved up here in 2008 from the Chicago area after having taught for 33 years high school at a place called Bolingbrook High School, which is southwest of Chicago. And my wife and I were both teachers and both retired, and we decided we would come north. Since then, I've become active, I guess, in writing poetry. I have joined the Wisconsin Writers Association, Wisconsin Fellowship of Poets. I'm part of the unabridged writing group here in Sturgeon Bay, which meets usually one day out of every month up at right on Door County. I have written before in my life. I've written some fiction. I was for 12 years a film critic for a string of papers in the southwest suburbs of Chicago, and belonged at that time to the Chicago Film Critics Association. So I've done a little bit of every type of writing when I had the time to do it. A lot of times, of course, I was consumed by what I was doing at school, teaching history and English. I had dreams of being a writer back from high school. So I used to write a lot in high school. I was one of those English students that was always bringing the latest short story or some piece of writing to my teacher to look at or critique. So I sort of naturally gravitated towards not only English, I was an avid reader, but also then other types of writing. So one of my interests in college was in film, and so it became a natural adjunct to get into writing about film. And once I started writing about film, I landed, like I say, a position at a string of, it was basically a town newspaper, Downers Grove Reporter, Progress newspapers, that were distributed over about maybe 4 or 5 different communities. And so I would do a weekly film review for them. I've had a couple of fiction pieces published in various journals and anthologies in the Chicago area, Tri-Quarterly and another Chicago magazine. Poetry was always something that I kind of dabbled in, not seriously, not until I retired. In 2008, I took a class up here with David Clowers through Learning in Retirement, an organization that they have here, which operates out of the Tech College here in Sturgeon Bay. And that kind of got me interested in writing, and since then, that's pretty much what I've done. I've written mostly poetry, though I also like to write some other things. I like to contribute political letters to the editor for the Peninsula Pulse and things like that. There's a whole tradition of political poetry that goes back, at least 200-300 years. And in this country, though, poetry has kind of been shoved to the side, thought to be too genteel, perhaps, or too aesthetic to get down and dirty with politics and issues and things like that. But I do enjoy expressing my political views sometimes, especially these days, with poetry. And in fact, I had a piece that was published in the LA Times. They did about 3-4 years ago on Labor Day weekend. They had a call for political poetry where you would choose an issue and put it into verse and send it to them, and if they liked it, they'd print it. And they accepted a poem of mine called Hobby Lobby Love, which was about the Hobby Lobby case at that time with regard to religious freedom.
Yeah.
So that was fun. Yeah, I have 3 books that I've written and I have out there. One of them is a poem of Door County poems called You Can Get Here From There, which is mostly focused on the county and the sorts of things that you might experience up here. Another one called Poetry Apocalypse, which is a collection of different verse, many of them about the craft of poetry, or sometimes riffing on the famous poets that I've really enjoyed reading. And then, of course, I have a political book called Mr. President, which is filled with all sorts of political poetry and what I call fan mail to the president, written from the point of view of somebody that is a true believer, tongue-in-cheek, and supporter of everything that he does. So I've also had stuff that's appeared in the Peninsula Pulse, which is a local paper up here. I've had things appear in Verse Wisconsin. There have been some other anthologies, Soundings, which is, again, more along the lines of a Door County Poet Collective publication, the LA Times, things like that. I, of course, grew up at a time when I think poetry probably still had a bit more prestige than it does now. So I, of course, was much influenced early on by people like T.S. Eliot, or E.E. Cummings. I loved reading some of these people that are fixtures in your literary anthologies that are used in schools. I also enjoyed, various poets from the Romantic era, the Classical era. I mean, I taught those things, and so pretty much you get that stuck in your mind. And as you're sometimes composing your own verse, you hear echoes from some of these voices from the past. Among poets of the Door County area, or in Wisconsin here, I think that there are really a lot of fine poets. Tom Davis and his wife Ethel, Ralph Murray, Sharon Auberly, David Clowers. There are just a number of different poets, and I'm sure you'll probably be talking to some of them while you're up here. But they're very good too. I think it's one of the strange things about modern poetry, though, today, is that more people write poetry than probably read it. To read poetry is to really love poetry. I think a lot of people find it easy sometimes to express difficult emotions or what they're feeling, a pent-up feeling they might have, by writing a poem. But oftentimes those things are not meant to be shared with anybody else. Yeah. And so the act of actually putting your stuff out there, it does take a little bit of bravery or foolishness to do that. You're never quite sure whether the things you've written are going to be received in the way that you intended. So I think that with regard to the state of modern poetry, you're never going to get rich, and writing a book of poetry or having a book of poetry out there is, I guess it's a fool's paradise in some regard, because, if you get any sales or if you get anybody noticing it at all, that's kind of special. But you don't go into it with that. The books that I put out there, I tend to see as legacy items. They're just something that maybe I leave behind. Somebody someday might pick them up. I often tell people, that if you don't really like it, it makes a great thing to level a wobbly table, because they're not very thick. They're often that right size to wedge underneath a table leg to balance things out.
Right, yeah.
So
I tell people
that's the useful side of poetry.
Right, yeah.
Well, as long as I'm still above ground seeking nourishment, I think I'd like to just continue expressing myself in what I write. I find it to be useful, to therapeutic perhaps, especially in this day and age, to put down in words what I'm thinking or feeling. I suppose I might look to publish another book. That's not a priority for me. What's more the priority is the enjoyment I get from playing around with words. I like to think of words as sort of pieces in a puzzle, and you kind of fit them together in different combinations and see what you can come up with. So that to me is the true enjoyment that I get. I appreciate that there are some people who like my stuff, or at least they're being very kind to me by telling me that they like my stuff. But again, it's not necessarily satisfaction measured in sales. Like I say, you're not going to get rich writing poetry. There's not going to be a phone call from Stephen Colbert saying, "Would you like to come on the show to talk about this dynamic new book that you have out there?" That's not going to happen. But what you might have is that somebody will find some sort of satisfaction or appreciation in it, or enjoyment in what I do, and that's pretty much what I'm in it for. Well, I used to say that poetry was sort of like prose distilled. So if you were to think of it along the lines of, oftentimes I think something that they could probably really grasp, alcohol, it would be like taking a very fine wine that you might have, which would be prose, but then distilling it into a brandy or letting it age into something that is truly exquisite. Poetry, I think, is the, again, making perhaps another analogy here, is like music. But sometimes poetry is more along the lines of adventurous jazz or music that looks to break through from some of the constraints that you might find in particular form. So, and there are some poets who can really do that quite well, and I've always admired that. I admire the people who can also take established forms like, say, a sonnet. Tom Davis writes great sonnets, but each of those sonnets is tweaked or twisted or distilled in a particular way that makes them fresh and vital and new. So you find like an old form, but done in a way that is really makes it feel fresh. I'm impressed by that, and I see that's where poetry is going. I think a poem can do in very few words what sometimes a story can do in several hundred or a couple thousand words. But it's a difficult process for some people to grasp. Students that I used to teach had the pejorative feeling that every poem must rhyme. If it doesn't rhyme, it can't be a poem. And to get them away from that particular idea into seeing that maybe a combination of words presented in a particular way might actually capture an emotion or a feeling that they're having. That's where I would like to go with it, and that's what I've tried to do in some of my stuff as well. Well, I think the Wisconsin poetry is doing a wonderful job of going in 1,000 different directions at the same time. There are so many unique voices in this community up here that it's amazing. Sturgeon Bay has a fantastic artistic community, and all of those different voices, like I say, moving in different directions at the same time. It's almost awesome to think about and to experience as you're living it. My stuff is so different from what other people are doing, and their stuff sometimes dazzles me. Ralph Murray can come up with some things that just completely dazzle me, and or Sharon Auberly, unique voices. And so I think that with just some encouragement, what little encouragement we get sometimes in publications like the Peninsula Pulse or the various writing groups that you might find around here, or what they do up at the Fellowship Hall in Ephraim, the once a month Dickinson series where a poet will come in and read, and they have an open mic, or what Pat McDonald does down here in Sturgeon Bay at the Tambourine Lounge with his Writers' Night. These are all wonderful resources for people to experience, both as listeners, if you just want to go and listen, but also as readers, so if you have something to contribute. So I'd just like to see the Wisconsin community continue to grow as it is, for new voices to be added. It heartens me that some of the events that I've attended have featured young writers, young poets, sometimes kids from school, high school, coming in to read. And I think that has to be encouraged. That's just a wonderful thing. I would say that, I'm just a dabbler, a dilettante who likes to dabble in some words. And if I can come up with something good, so much the better. I usually write in the morning. I'll wake up, usually the dog will get me up. I'll let the dog out and feed him, and then I'll come back to bed. And I've taken to writing on a laptop computer that I'll just kind of prop on my expanding belly or on my lap, and I will start with something. Sometimes it's just a word or a phrase or an idea that popped into my head, maybe as long ago as a month or so, or as recently as that morning, and I'll start and I'll piece something together, and then I'll come back to it and work on it over the next few days, sometimes the next few weeks, until it kind of represents what I want it to be, at which point I just kind of go on to something else. That's my process. It's not very scientific, and it's probably not very good. Certainly not very disciplined, but it works for me. Since some people are always nervous about political poetry, my wife especially. When I write a political poem, and if I'm up at the UU in Ephraim, she'll say, "Don't read that one. You might be offending somebody. There could be somebody here who doesn't want to hear that type of poetry." And so I'll have to say, "Well, come on. That's what this is all about."
It really is, yeah.
So here's one that I wrote a little bit ago. It's called "Orange is the New Black Brother." It addresses one of the poets that I taught in school, Langston Hughes. "What say you now, Langston Hughes? Like you, I too am America, but my dreams were deferred at compounded interest. Unlike you, I shouldered the burden of a $400 million inheritance that bought my place at the table. Hell, it bought the damn kitchen and a huge hotel to house it. You may know rivers, but I know real estate, and the best locations aren't in Harlem. You sing the weary blues, man, but I tweet of sweet yesterdays that maybe never were, but what does that matter? We both want the same. Let America be America again, even if that means a different thing. The walls that I imagine are real, my darker brother, and the crystal stairs I descend are escalators." I'll read you one about my process if you want to hear that.
Please.
This one's called Muddle Brown. My poems are much the muddy muddle of words at play in shallow puddles, splashing rhymes with metered feet and making fun and low conceit. The tracks they leave, such tiny prints, may lose their color with every rinse, as vibrant reds and lush greens drown into a mix of mushy brown. But when I'm with them in the gutter, frolicking in starts and stutters, who cares I've nothing much to say? The pleasure's in such sloppy play. This one I wrote for, there's a website out there you're probably familiar with, Your Daily Poem. And I wrote this one for Jane Farrar. It's called The Salutary Effects of Poetry. Poetry, per se, these days will never make me wealthy. But a poem a day consumed, I say, is key to staying healthy. There's something in the well-turned phrase, or in the measured line, that lifts the spirit in such ways, approximating wine. There's ecstasy in metaphor, a state of grace imbued when words in combination form a heightened amplitude. The body takes its nourishment from what it can digest, in meats, in grains, and nutriments that make for robustness. But souls subsist in sweeter things than what can tease the tongue, and poetry that soars and sings keeps old men feeling young. Yeah, I'm Mike Orlock. Hey, go out and have a great poetry month. Go into a local bookstore, if one still exists, and rummage around in the poetry volumes. You might find something there. Probably won't change your life, but it will at least help balance a wobbly table.